Well, welcome to our Ask podcast, and this time, Greg, we're not like distanced in Melbourne. We're here in Sydney. We're at the cathedral. You are here for what reason?
I've got a couple of speaking engagements relating to my book, Christians,
Yeah.
and I'm speaking at the graduation ceremony of Campion College on Wednesday. So, and I'm pretending to be a foreign editor at the same time. So I'm doing some of that.
Yeah, and I'd love to do this. I mean, we mentioned submarines before. I'd love to talk about South Korea and all the rest of it, but we won't do that this time because we're going to talk about something much more important: the Apostle Paul. Why did you write a chapter on Paul in a book about Christ?
David, it's great to be talking to you here next to St Andrew's Cathedral, opposite the town hall, scene of many happy moments in my youth.
Yeah. Was it a dance place? No?
No, we used to have our school speech nights there.
All right.
And when I became a journalist, the ALP used to have its annual conference there.
Right,
So
okay.
that was a week of wild fun, the ALP annual conference, which I always covered because it was so much fun.
Yeah.
And the Sydney Symphony Orchestra used to play free concerts there. So
Right.
it was everything when I was a kid, you know.
Right.
Why did I write about Paul? Well, Paul is a uniquely compelling figure. And a lot of people mistakenly say that Paul was the real founder of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I know what they mean. He was the organisational genius of the first generation.
Yeah.
And he left these great writings, the letters of Paul, which I think run to about 75 or 80 pages in the Bible. So he wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else.
Yeah.
And his writings are unique, and they've had a unique consequence. And I think he uniquely brought together what you might call the theory of the Jesus movement, understanding the theology and everything, with the practicality of being an organisational genius.
Yeah.
And he was an irascible, fabulous character whose humanity is on full display throughout the New Testament.
He's tough as well, isn't he? I mean, you talk about he gets beaten, he's the ultimate revolutionary. I love this, you've got the title, Christ Lenin. By the way, Antony Flew, when he wrote his book, There Is a God, just before he died, had a chapter in which he basically said, the same as you, he said the combination of Jesus and Paul is the most brilliant combination in history and beats all the competition.
That's right.
So,
well, I think Paul was perhaps the second most consequential person in history after Jesus.
Yeah.
And, although, I mean, there's a bit of a competition for that. I guess you could make a case for Mary and for Peter. But the reason I compared him to Lenin, of course, was he couldn't have been less like Lenin personally and morally. I mean, Lenin was a communist tyrant, a murderer. Lenin did not like to listen to Beethoven because it made him feel kindly towards his fellow human being, whereas Paul was an apostle of love. But Lenin had the same combination as Paul. He understood the theory, and he understood how to turn Marxism into a system of government. Paul was this organisational genius for Christianity. He was a revolutionary. He tore the mind apart of the ancient world. His universalism, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, etc., was revolutionary in the ancient world. He had tremendous energy in establishing Christian churches and encouraging Christian churches. And he certainly did more, I think, than any other one person in the early church to create a Christian movement.
I definitely think so, because if we were to look at a map of the Mediterranean, the fact that he does Syria, Turkey, Greece, nips over, eventually does go to Rome.
Yes.
It's on his way to Spain. Now, it's possible he did go to Spain and came back and then was killed in Rome. But, the extraordinary energy, the extraordinary ability, and he does have an impression of being kind of a hard man, and yet when you read the letters, there's this incredible compassion and personableness. I love his letter to the Romans where he talks about just a whole list of people, some of whom he'd never met, and it's just very personal. That's what I found about him, The
humanity of Paul is terrific. So there were some rough edges to Paul. And I dwell on those a bit because I think neither Christians nor non-Christians fully celebrate them. And that's part of his humanity. So Paul wasn't perfect. And he never thought he was perfect. He lamented the thorn in his flesh, the tendency to sinfulness, which he had himself. And he could be fantastically irascible.
Yeah.
He was wonderfully generous and loving on one hand, but at the same time, you could have ferocious arguments to each other. My favourite book of Paul's is Galatians, and he's arguing about whether converts to Christianity have to convert to Judaism first, which would have been very difficult for them because adult men would have had to get circumcised, which would have been a significant pastoral problem, forget about the theology of it all. And then he's so annoyed with the people misleading the Galatians, he says, I wish they would all go and castrate themselves.
I know, that is a brilliant line.
And you think, wow, I didn't know that was in the scripture, you know. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, he spends a lot of time fundraising.
Yeah.
I mean, he has to deal with all the sordid practicalities of life. He gets discouraged at moments, you know. He talks about despairing almost to death and so on. And yet at the same time, he is alive always with a vision of the risen Christ.
Yeah, it's that there is that earthiness in Paul, Luther style almost. There's a bit where he talks about, I had all these things. I was a tribe of Benjamin, an Israelite of the Israelites, a Pharisee, and then we politely put it, I count it all as dung, but in Scottish terms, say it's shite, And I'm just going, you can't say that,
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I said that from the pulpit, even saying it now, somebody will say, look, it's there in the Bible, guys, if you really... But I mean, it's just, there's this passion. The revolutionary thing, by the way, do you know the Marxist historian Christopher Hill? No. Slightly, yeah. He wrote a book called The World Turned Upside Down. And it was about the English Civil War, about the Puritans. And he's a Marxist.
Yes.
And he was using the, what's the phrase? Acts 17, verse 6. Yes. These are they who've turned the world upside down.
Yes.
Which is really quite extraordinary.
Yes.
And that's the revolutionary thing, turning the world upside down.
It is. And he was a revolutionary. I quote the great, I think, Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who says Paul and those Christians around him were revolutionaries. They brooked no compromise with the pagan world. They didn't challenge it politically or militarily, but they brooked no compromise with it.
Yeah. Now, you talk about the writings of Paul. Again, you've spent a lot of time looking at all of this from a journalist's perspective as well. You talk about, and I think this is a very good thing, how Christians tend to, shall I say this, particularly Protestant Christians, evangelicals, they tend to go chapter and verse and it's actually a really good thing just to read a letter straight through, because it would have been read straight through. So if Paul had written a letter to the church in Sydney, and I'm assuming he would have been an Anglican, but, he would have been a Presbyterian, but we won't say that. And it was read here, he would expect it to be read in a oneer, and we don't often do that, do we?
I think that's right, David. So if this book has a little element of innovation about it, it's an attempt to approach the New Testament as a journalist. Mm-hmm. So there's no, I'm not hiding any bias here. I believe the New Testament is true. So I start as someone who believes it's true. But I'm reading it as a journalist. Mm-hmm. And I think not only Protestants, but really all Christians tend to read the Bible verse by verse, looking for theological significance. That's perfectly orthodox. You go to church every Sunday, there's a passage from the Bible, the priest or the pastor or whoever talks about what it means and so on. But as you say, all literature should be read initially the way it was meant to be read, for its meaning.
Yes.
Now later on you read it theologically and everything, but first up, and even if it's not first up, at least once in your life, read it from start to finish, a book at a time.
Yeah.
The longest book of Paul's is only 11 pages or something, so you're not going to die of old age while you read it.
Yeah.
And most of the meaning, now some of it is hard, some of it you won't understand, but 95% of it is totally accessible, and you'll get it straight away. Yeah. And then, of course, you get the sense of his personality as well. Well,
because as we spoke in an earlier podcast, the Bible is the inspired word of God, but it's not dictated. It's mediated through human personality, and Paul's definitely comes. I love the fact as well that we're doing this here in the square where we can hear all the different noises around. And I'm sure Jason's got all this. We don't need to edit them all out, because Paul was a marketplace guy.
Absolutely.
He wasn't a guy who, hid away in a cloister or anything like that. He was there. I mean, I've been to the Areopagus, and have you been there, by the way, in Athens? Have you been to Athens?
No, I haven't. No.
It's remarkable. It's absolutely, and the courage of the guy standing there and going, "You see that multi-billion-pound building? You've wasted your time." because God doesn't live there. I'm going, boy, you have some nerve.
And in Athens, very much like Chinese Christians today, he was accused of preaching foreign gods.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, he was preaching the universal God.
Yeah.
But you're right, Paul was a marketplace guy. He was the first urban intellectual in the Christian movement. So one of the great strengths of Christianity in its first days and today was the variety of people it brought in. So it's good, I think, that Peter was the leader. Peter was wiser than Paul, more level-headed, not as brilliant, not as clever, but wiser. And there's a lovely passage in Peter where he says, yeah, look, I know Paul's a bit difficult, you know.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah.
But guess what?
Yeah.
His writings are scripture. He is my beloved brother. You put up with him whether you like it or not. And at the start of Galatians, Paul goes up to Jerusalem and seeks from Peter, John and James approval for what he's about to preach. But Paul was unlike any of those guys. He was a master of classical Greek. So he's a master of these three universes, the Judaic universe, the Greek universe and the Roman universe. He was a citizen of Rome. He took from Judaism the monotheism, the interaction with God. He took from classical Greek culture philosophy, Greek philosophy, the rationality of Greek philosophy, and he took from Rome cosmopolitanism, kind of early version of globalism and universalism. And he welded those together completely uniquely. And as you say, he was fearless. So he'd go to marketplace. He'd also start out at the synagogue every time.
Until he got thrown out.
Until he got thrown out, then he'd go somewhere else.
I love him for that.
He'd work as his tent maker. That was his trade. And he dealt with all the practicalities of life. And he had good friends, and he fell out with his friends from time to time. You know?
I think that's great. I want to, as you can see, just to show you I wasn't actually kidding, I do actually highlight things in the book. So I want to just do a couple of highlights in this chapter. No Christian should ever disparage Judaism, the chosen vessel of God for revealing himself to humanity. Now, what intrigues me, I grew up in a tradition which is very different from maybe some others. I was always taught as a Scottish Presbyterian, the Jews were God's chosen people. The Scots were second, or we were the new chosen people, but the Jews were God's chosen people. And I think if I'm right, the Scots were the only country in Europe who never had a law against the Jews. How come, this is a bit of a sideline, but not entirely, how come Christianity became associated with anti-Semitism? That for me is a bizarre thing.
Well, like you, I grew up always understanding that the Jews were God's chosen people. And I had a lovely maiden aunt, Auntie Poppy. I wrote about her in a previous book, a memoir. She always used to say that to us. She always used to say, now remember, Gregory, she'd say, the Jews are God's chosen people. And in fact, this is a real digression, but it seems that she was actually my father's mother. And the only man she ever was known to keep company with was Jewish. So it may be that I have some Jewish ancestry. Who knows? But I do think the tradition of Christian anti-Semitism, I'll say this square on, I've written about it many times, is one of the worst elements of Christianity in its history. So Christianity as a religion, as an ideal, as a teaching is beautiful, it's magnificent, and it's true. But when the truth goes wrong, it's terrible. And the truth went wrong in conflating the death of Jesus with the Jewish people themselves. That was wrong. So technically Jesus was put to death by the Romans, not by the Jews. But in any event, it's simply wrong to oppose the Jews to Christianity. Yet, a lot of Christians have done that. A lot of famous Christians, a lot of Christians who have otherwise taught good things. And there are many things where I find tradition better than modernity. But there's one element of modern Christianity which I like much better than medieval Christianity, which is every Christian denomination now, I think, stands absolutely 100% against anti-Semitism. And
I wish that were true. I think it's generally true.
Well,
there are. I can think of some exceptions, but
maybe 90% of them or something.
But that's in a sense that's a whole other subject. But it is really important. I mean, Paul's a Jew. All the early followers of Jesus are Jews. Jesus was a Jew. That's the one that gets me.
And neither Paul nor Jesus ever denied or disparaged their Jewishness.
Yeah.
So another thing I like very much in recent biblical scholarship is an increased emphasis on the Jewishness of Jesus and the Jewishness of Paul and the Jewishness of the environment of the first Christians, and how you understand Christianity that bit better if you understand the Jewish roots and the Jewish context of it all. And Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to oppose the law. He hasn't said everything in Jewish life up till now is wrong. He said, now I'm fulfilling and giving you a new covenant and so forth. And Paul was the great universalist. Paul is not, he's not the most popular Christian saint with a lot of Jewish communities because they see him as the final disruption between Christianity and Judaism. On the other hand, the Nazis blamed Paul for breaking the idea of a nation state being tied to an ethnicity. So there are passages in Nazi ideology where they try to fit up Jesus as a good Aryan. I mean, this is ridiculous, of course. And Paul as a wicked Jew cosmopolite who cut the tie between blood and nation. But I would say to you, David, I wouldn't hide in the bushes about this at all. I think the Christian tradition of anti-Semitism, which was always opposed by many, many Christians, and was never official doctrine really. Nonetheless, I think Christians have a lot to be ashamed of historically in the anti-Semitism many of them practice.
Yeah, I mean, I have come across it. I have a confession to make to you, okay? G.K. Chesterton is not my favourite Catholic. He's my second favourite. My favourite is Pascal. And Pascal in his Pensées says that the survival of the Jewish people is a great proof for the existence of God. I'd never, but he's basically saying they've been persecuted, and he was writing it at a time when that was the case also. But I mean, it was so deeply ingrained. I just thought that was fascinating. Let me come on to this one. Again, I have to mention this because I feel very much that somebody wrote me this week, by the way, and said, that was a great conversation you had about angels. It's about, he said it was like minds meeting. So I don't know if that's a compliment for you or for me, but
bad for your career, but there you go.
Yeah. But a book I absolutely love is Inventing the Individual: The Origins of Western Liberalism, Larry Siddentop. And I mean, he titled it "The World Turned Upside Down." Now, this is, again, it's a slight aside, but I do want to commend this book. You say Siddentop, whose book is the most magnificent, sweeping and convincing book of history I've ever known, is not given to exaggeration. That is some commendation. It's a great book, though, isn't it?
I think it's the best history book I've ever read. Inventing the Individual, I think it's called. And it greatly influenced my last book, God is Good for You, and a chapter I wrote about how modern liberalism was a child of Christianity. Yeah. And I think it's a magnificent history. It's so ambitious. It goes through a sweep of ideas over 2,000 years.
Yeah.
It refers to all the primary sources, and it gives you enough of the primary sources that you can make your own judgment. Now, I don't think Larry Siddentop is a practicing Christian.
Yeah.
A friend of mine in London is a friend of his. Yeah. And when he read my book, God is Good for You, and saw how much I was indebted to Siddentop, very honestly, I didn't plagiarise him, I paid a tribute to him. He said, oh, I'll send this book to Larry. And I said, no, don't do that. What if he doesn't like it? And I was so nervous. And he actually arranged lunch. So a couple of years ago, I had lunch with Larry Siddentop in London. He was the most wonderful guy. Must be in his late 80s. He's in terrific form.
Right.
And
I'd love to meet him. I'm so jealous.
So clever.
That book, when I read that book, it was one of the ones that I just thought, no, I'm not highlighting anything. I just thought it was thrilling because it took all the bits of history I knew and put them all together and explained how we got the modern world and how we got the idea of Western liberalism, which is thoroughly Christian.
Absolutely. It's not a repudiation of Christianity. It's a fulfillment of Christianity or an expression of Christianity. I asked him at the lunch, and I mean, I was like a fanboy meeting Michael Jackson or something, or some equivalent, and I was tittering with nerves and so on. Luckily, my friend who arranged it was there and so forth. And he was so generous about my feeble book. But I asked him, I said, what made you ask this question about, where did modern liberalism come from, or did it come from Christianity? And he said, well, I was thinking about the Enlightenment, and I was thinking, how did they get to that view? what thought process led them to that view? And of course, they were drawing on all the Christianity that went before them. They weren't saying now we're damning that Christianity and in opposition to it. They were fulfilling it. And in fact, he argues in Inventing the Individual that everything in modern liberalism that we like had been thoroughly thought through by Christians by the late Middle Ages.
Yeah. And what I loved was how he talked about how it took centuries for it to work through the culture.
Yes.
And I feel, just as a general thing, what we are doing right now, what people do not realize they are doing is they're putting the axe to the root of the tree and they're destroying all the fruit that they want to see. You know, so the idea of defending Western liberalism, which I would say I want to do, is not let's protect the church. The church will do fine. You know, if we go back to the pagan ways, which is I think what will happen, the church will do fine. It thrived there anyway.
Yes.
But I think it's the harm in the rest of society, and I think Sydenham brings that out incredibly well. I mean, I always had that instinct, but to have it expressed so clearly and oh, it's just wonderful. Okay, one fruit of that. So this is where ignorance comes in. Slavery. So Paul's responsible for slavery because, you know, he says slaves obey your masters and so on. Answer that one.
Well, I think a few things about it. So it's a subject I thought about a lot, of course. The early Christian movement had no political power at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely none. It had no capability to abolish slavery. What it asked all of its followers to do was to behave morally and to behave with love of God and love for their fellow human beings. So it imposed the first limits on masters of slaves about how they could treat their slaves. So imposing rules of sexual morality for slave owners was the first bodily protection that slaves ever had. And when Paul is returning a slave or sending a slave back to, is it Philemon, to his owner?
Yeah, Philemon to Onesimus, yeah.
He says to the owner, to Onesimus, you must treat him as your brother. You must treat him as you would treat me.
Yeah.
And you must love this man who has been a good and faithful servant to me. And not only that, this is typical Paul, I'm going to come and see you in a little while and make sure that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
So the question is, how did Christians interact with slaves? They decided very early that slaves were morally the equivalent of slave owners. Slaves had immortal souls. They didn't quite use those terms, but slaves had immortal relationship with God. Lots of bishops were former slaves. When Benedict established Western monasticism, or the Benedictine version of it, it was tremendously democratic because everybody had to wear the same gear. So whether you were a former nobleman or a former slave, and there were lots of both in the monastery, you were the same. And lots of abbots were former slaves. Some of them were former noblemen. Now, I do think there is something equivocal in Christianity's past in that it was equivocal about slavery. There were lots of people who condemned it, lots of Christians who condemned it, and Europe more or less abolished it before the New World, became a big deal for them. But nonetheless, the failure absolutely right at the start, not right at the start in the Gospels, but within the first few centuries to say this is wrong. So that's a limitation. Christians were human beings. They made mistakes as well as got things right.
Yeah, but I think, I'll push back a little bit against you with that. I think what you said here, the early Christians had no power to abolish slavery. That's true. I think actually when you get to this time where there is power, you do find the pushback against slavery, a lot. But then the trouble is with power and everything else, there come all other kinds of problems. But, I mean, my reading of the history is that there could have been as many as 60 million slaves. And this idea that we would say, oh, let's all rise up against slavery, would have been a bloodbath. It would have been absolutely awful. And instead, this is where the Siddentop thing comes in. It's changing the attitudes bit by bit.
Yes.
And the New Testament forbids slave trading. Well, you stop, as Wilberforce found out.
Yes.
Stop slave trading, you stop slavery. So you were forbidden from slave trading as a Christian.
And the early Christians raised huge amounts of money to buy the freedom of slaves.
Yeah.
And so they would raise charitable money and use their own money to buy slaves to set them free. And as I say, many early bishops were slaves and so on. So I agree, you can't ask for a council of perfection.
Yeah.
You know, why weren't Christians Republicans right from
Yeah.
the start? Why did they ever allow monarchy to go on, which is undemocratic and so on? I'd agree with that. It's complex and so on. Having said that, there are a lot of cruel slave owners who were Christians, just as there are a lot of Christians did lots of bad things right across the board.
Yeah, yeah. I think, that kind of professing thing. Well, the guys up around us are busy packing up the last of the tables, so I think we'll finish with... I want to read this bit, though. Christianity was extraordinarily liberating and empowering for ordinary people in Paul's time. It asked them to have faith in Jesus, to die to the sins of the flesh, and in exchange to inherit the cosmos. And the way the Christians lived, not killing their infant daughters, practicing sexual restraint, viewing marriage as an institution of mutual love, caring for the sick and the poor, finding fellowship with each other no matter what their social or ethnic backgrounds, this too became immensely attractive to people from all backgrounds and classes. I think particularly women and slaves. But this is where I think you are so right to put Paul in as a chapter, because Paul is taking the teaching of Jesus and the ethics of Jesus, and in a sense, he's organizing them, politicizing them, and showing them how it applies in Rome, in Corinth, in Turkey, in Spain, in Africa, you know. And that, I don't think there's anyone who's changed the world, other than Jesus, more than Paul.
I think that's right, and so I'd offer two reflections there.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. In that context, Paul, in a sense, is also a tremendously modern figure.
Yes.
A very easy figure for
Yes.
modern people to relate to.
Yes.
First of all, he wasn't around when Jesus was around. So he had his own personal vision of Jesus, his own personal spiritual encounter with Jesus. But he wasn't there. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles.
Yeah.
And therefore, like modern people, his relationship with Jesus was spiritual, and it shows how close a relationship we can have.
Yeah.
And the second reflection I'd offer is that what Paul was doing is what Christians have had to try to do for the next 2,000 years and on into the future. Work out how to apply Jesus' teachings to the situation they're in today. So Paul is full of specific advice to his communities.
Yeah.
You know, if you find your brother doing the wrong thing, go and admonish him quietly, and so on and so on. And in that way, there's not that much cultural distance between the modern person and Paul. He's an easy guy to relate to, I think. He's a bit stern. You think he might have been a bit tough on you if you'd come in and he'd have said, "What? You only worked 68 hours this week?" You know. Well,
I love that. I love that. Greg, thank you so much. Great to see you in person. We'll have
wonderful to be here in this context.
Yeah, we'll have to do this in Melbourne sometime. I could quite like, talking to you personally, and we'll go and get ourselves a wee something to drink, and I'm going to come and hear you speak tonight about this book that I've got to know so well, and all the listeners and viewers of this are getting to know as well. I mean, there have been people who've been writing to me saying, "Oh, I'm going to get this. This is on my Christmas list. This is so
wonderful.
It's great."
Very much, David.
But it's so wonderful, and we look at this stuff and we think, yeah, this is where the modern world is. People say, well, how has this got anything to do with the modern world? This is exactly to do with the modern world. So it's great.
I think that's right. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, and thanks to Jason, we have a cameraman this time. So
God bless you,
great.
Jason.
Yeah. See ya. Great.